You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Jason Herbert. He describes himself as a storyteller and a Kentucky Colonel. I'll need to tell him that the Kentucky Colonels were just made up because of the Indiana Sagamore the Wabash Award, but we'll get to that. He holds a Ph.D. from the University of Minnesota with a focus on indigenous and environmental history. He currently serves as a tribal relations specialist for the United States Forest Service. The reason that we're having him on today, besides to expose you to his terrific personality and his funny Twitter feed, and it is, or X feed, he runs a terrific series. That's what we'll call it. It's called Historians at the Movies. It's the longest running watch party on the internet. And Historians at the Movies podcast, which talks about history through film and everything else in between. Dr. Herbert, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, man. How are you? Welcome to Colorado.
I have some friends out there. I've never been myself, but everyone says it's absolutely beautiful. I'm a Dolphins fan, so I couldn't go out there and root for the Broncos. Sorry.
But no, actually, West Palm Beach is home to me. So I'm from Kentucky, but like South Florida is actually home. So I feel you there. I don't have a lot of friends here. I have exes here in Colorado, which makes it awesome. But we get by with what we can.
I discovered your efforts, your podcast, your shows, just randomly on X, and reached out because of the nature of this podcast, which is to discuss on many episodes history and historical figures and events. And I'm thrilled to have you on. A lot of it because when I have historians on the podcast, and I've had some terrific ones, Harold Holzer, Michael Burlingame, Susanna Lipscomb from England, the list goes on and on. Terrific. I asked them, what is your favorite history movie? And so when I stumbled upon you on X, I couldn't resist inviting you on the podcast. Please tell the Leaders and Legends audience why you started this very interesting series.
Yeah, so HATM, as it's come to be known, has really evolved in a couple different paths. I'm like a lot of people can't see me right now. I'm literally wearing a Star Wars villains t-shirt right now. I am a child of the 80s. I grew up in the 80s watching Star Wars and Indiana Jones and everything else under the sun. And as life went on, I found myself called into kind of a path of being a historian. And this kind of goes back to an old conversation I had with an archaeologist friend of mine named Lisa Overholter. She's a tremendous archaeologist at McGill University up in Canada. And there's an old thing between archaeologists and historians. Archaeologists get Harrison Ford. They get Indiana Jones. Historians get Nicolas Cage. We get Benjamin Franklin Gates. We get National Treasure, right? But that's okay because we all love it. It's a fun movie and so forth, right? And I had noticed it. I was living in Florida at the time, working on my dissertation. about Florida history and had seen that it was on Netflix one night. And I was like, hey, we should all watch this together just as a way to blow off steam. The idea is like historians are always busy thinking about thoughts and deep, unless it's me. And I was like, this will be a good way to turn off the brain for a couple hours one July night back in like 2018. And a bunch of people on Twitter said, okay. And we created a hashtag just at spur of the moment, HATM, just something short people could find on Twitter. So we all watched the film together, right? But as we were watching it, we had Joanne Freeman, professor at Yale, does a lot of early American history. A lot of other folks come on. The writers of National Treasure come on. That got exciting. But everybody's kind of tweeting along as we're watching. It's a lot of fun. And got done with it. Hey, everybody, that was great. We'll do it again sometime. And everyone was like, no, again, next week. And you do it. So I was like, oh, okay. So we ended up watching Lincoln the next week, and then Marie Antoinette, and then Coco, and Trading Places. And after that, we were off to the races. And that's really what happened was over the last, say, 5.5 years, this became a space where I started to conceptualize what history and film do as far as storytelling, letting us think about the past, think about our own lives now, where we want our lives to be in the future, things like that, and realizing that movies are really an incredible medium for thinking about the past and so forth. So it really became the antithesis of what it originally started as, which was an idea just to blow off steam for 2 hours a night, one Sunday night, to not think about history. And now we've been doing this watch party now for almost 6 years. And now not only do we have that, we also have the HATM podcast, which is a deeper dive that kind of frees us from, say, watching something that's on Netflix or whatever, and talking about more about using films to talk about larger histories and things like that, dive deeper in. So that's really been kind of, in a lot of ways, become what I'm probably more well known for on social media. I don't want to sound like I'm like anybody special or anything like that, but it's in a lot of ways the work has surpassed my own scholarship. And that's okay, because the way I always approach it when I talk to people, like, oh, am I a historian? Can I listen? I was like, listen, everybody's a historian of their own experience, right? So that's what we do. Every weekend we watch a movie together. Last week we watched Predator with the 1987 Arnold Schwarzenegger, Carl Weathers film. This week we're watching Love and Basketball to talk about all the things surrounding that. And we've got the podcast as well. And that's where we're at.
So how would someone participate?
Participating is really easy. If you've got a Twitter, an X account, people are always like, I'm calling it Twitter. It's just because that's who I am, right? And back in my day, we call it Twitter. It's pretty easy. You follow me on Twitter at Herbert History, or anybody. You don't have to follow me, but you look for the hashtag HATM. And every Sunday night, really all you have to do is press play on whatever film that we're watching. Like I said, this coming week, we're going to do Love and Basketball, and following week, we'll watch the Oscars together. We do an Oscars party every year as well. You just push play at exactly that time, and then you tweet along with the hashtag. You'll follow the hashtag, and then as you're watching the movie, you'll comment on what you're seeing or what other people are talking about and things like that, and get involved in these conversations. And early on, the idea was like, we'll invite scholars on to talk about these things as we're watching them and things like that. And that still happens. But the thing I always emphasize more than anything else, the most important thing about HATM to me now is that it's a community. It's a community of people who, no matter who you are, where you're at, or anything like that, whoever, you're welcome here. Sunday nights, 8 p.m. I don't care about your religion, your faith, your politics, your whoever you are. You are welcome in this space. We're going to watch a movie together. We're going to hang out on a couch across the United States, and we've had branches of this in the UK and also Australia. You're welcome here. This is a space where you can come in, watch a movie, chit chat, shoot the breeze, and then talk some history, talk some movie, talk about, you can be snarky. Not all these movies are great, right? Sometimes we have fun with them, right? That's okay. That's the space we're trying to really create with HATM. It's a space where people can come in, enjoy some time together, and actually have this really good experience online on social media, which sometimes feels hard to do.
We are discussing Historians at the Movies, which is a watch party on the internet, and Historians at the Movies podcast with Jason Herbert. He is a storyteller, holds a Ph.D. from the University of Minnesota, and is a Kentucky Colonel, which I just find, I've known about those for years, including the old ABA team, the Kentucky Colonels, as you and I both, I think, grew up in the 70s, 80s. As you just went through a litany of some of your movies. They don't have to be Braveheart, Napoleon. I want to ask you about those sorts of movies later on, but for example, what makes you choose a movie like Trading Places? A terrific, I think, 1983 movie starring Dan Aykroyd and Ralph Bellamy, Eddie Murphy, and several others.
It's so funny you keyed in on that particular movie because, Robert, that was really the film that changed the way that I looked at quote unquote history movies, right? When we talk about history movies and things like that, of course, the natural thing is think about like Braveheart or Gettysburg or Gone with the Wind or these epics, Gladiator, these period films and things like that. But that's not what history films necessarily are. In fact, the kind of argument I make is that all films are history films, right? That they're either explicitly talking about an event, say Braveheart or Gladiator or whatever, or they become archival material and talking about moments in time, especially when we look at a movie like Trading Places. And that was, if you look at the very first few films that we did, which were National Treasure, which directly plays with history, the Declaration of Independence, things like that. Then Lincoln, Marie Antoinette, very explicitly, okay, these are history movies. Let's look at Trading Places. It comes out in 1983. Here's a film where you could watch this movie and see Philadelphia in 1983. We can go back and see this. We can also watch this film and see, okay, what are the concerns that are being addressed in this film? This whole movie is about getting even with the bad guys who are wealthy. So is it a critique of capitalism? Or is it an endorsement of capitalism? Because ultimately, all the guys get rich too, right? There's that. You can see the kind of jokes that are being told. You can see the questions. You can see what the stock market looks like. You can do all of these different things. This becomes a real archival piece to understand what the United States looked like and what American culture looked like. And then you get to start to ask these questions about, okay, this movie was a hit. Why? Why did people go to this film? Why did this movie resonate? Why did the producers think this movie would do well? What does this tell us about the audience writ large at the time period? So looking at things like that, you can use these films as real pieces of history. It's the reason why all movies are history movies, because you can really start to use a movie and start to build questions around it once your mind is open to it. And like I said, that was really the film that opened it to me. To answer the second part of your question, how do I choose a movie? This will sound hokey. The most important thing for me when I'm choosing a film is actually diversity. And by that, I want to make sure that everybody feels welcome on Sunday nights. And I want to show a big, broad array of films that we've done. So we can show Glory one night, but we'll also show Marie Antoinette. We'll also show Quigley Down Under. I want to show a big diversity of time periods, of things that are being addressed, tone as well. Trading Places is the comedy, right? Lincoln is definitely not. Neither is Jaws, it turns out. All of those films, but also things like Jurassic Park. The biggest films we've had, the biggest nights, the most fun nights we've had are when people are talking about, I remember when I saw this movie the very first time. I remember where I was in 1993 when I went to see the theater, and then there was the cup on the Jeep, and then the ripples from the T-Rex, and we all lost our minds, right? People have these real relationships with movies, and they can use those movies to pinpoint where they were at a certain point of their lives. I remember all my friends going to see Independence Day when it came out, and I had to work that night. I was all mad that night that I couldn't go see it. So there's that. I also want to make sure the representation is really important. Hollywood tends to put out films typically starring lots of straight white leads, and that's fine, right? But I also want to make sure that we are showing people of color, that we are showing different genders on screen, all these kinds of different things, so that people understand. You're not gonna attract a wide audience by only telling one kind of a story. So I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable that we're exposing the human story to Sunday nights, and that's not always possible because of what's either available either on Netflix or Amazon Prime. And that's what we use is, hey, everybody turn into this TV show or this movie that's available on Netflix or Amazon Prime, and then we'll watch it. So you could also ask questions about, hey, why aren't there more movies about dinosaurs or whatever? Those are the big things I try to do, is vary what we're talking about and make sure how we're talking about it, be it drama, comedy, whatever, and also making sure that there's a diversity of faces and stories being told.
One of the questions I ask historians when they come on the podcast is, do you have a favorite history movie? And the answers are not predictable, but there's a sense of, I'm a professor of Civil War history, so of course I like Lincoln, or I'm a professor of Cold War history, so I like 13 Days. But the question I ask, and I'm going to ask you, is, does your knowledge of history interfere with your ability to enjoy the movie? If, leaving Trading Places aside just for a second, if you're watching what is basically a pure biopic or history movie, do you spend your time going, no, that's not what happened? No,
Not really.
they got that wrong.
No. So there's an idea behind that called rivet counting. And that's a kind of a thing I push back. People, oh, historians are watching movies so they come to the podcast. Oh, I don't want to listen to people going, oh, that's not right, or that's not right, or there weren't that many soldiers at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, or whatever.
There was no bridge at the Battle of Stirling Bridge.
I don't care about that. I really don't. There are plenty of history nerds out there that will do that. That is not what I'm about, and that's not what HATM is about. Of course, there are times when you're watching a film like The Patriot, and there are all these free Black people working on Mel Gibson's plantation in South Carolina in 1774. Come on. But at the same time, then we could ask these questions about, okay, wait a second. Why were they so afraid to show that these people working for Benjamin Martin would have actually been enslaved Africans? What does that allow us to do? To talk about. But I don't spend a lot of time going, oh, that's not accurate, or this. We can, but that doesn't get in the way of me enjoying a film, because films are not supposed to be 100% accurate. There's the old adage, never let facts get in the way of a good story. I understand that. You've got to take license with story, with history. If you're going to tell history films and things like that's going to happen. So what I like to be able to do is be able to take a film and maybe sometimes curate it. If I'm talking when I was teaching at University of Minnesota, or when I was teaching in high school as I was writing my dissertation, teach my students like, hey, these are the questions you can ask about these films to look at them critically. But man, sometimes I just want to sit back and watch things blow up. That's okay, right? It's a movie. It's supposed to, in a lot of ways, it's supposed to just be an enjoyable thing.
Was there a movie you saw perhaps as a kid or a teenager that helped accelerate or deepen your interest in history?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, the first two films I talked about, which are actually Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark. And for so many of us, they were. And you look at Star Wars, the very first thing, that opening crawl, right? A long time ago in a galaxy far away. Star Wars is a history movie. It's actually based on a lot of other things. And of course, Raiders is very explicitly talking about history and playing with the past and things like that. So there was always, for me, Robert, a call, an interest in these stories of people who had lived. And then as I grew up and things like that, I remember in seventh grade getting really interested in Greek history, like as Alexander the Great was this really cool guy, and learning about all that kind of stuff, learning about Romans and things like. I just like storytelling. In a lot of ways, that kind of became reflected in just who I am as a person, that I became a historian. And now with HATM, really playing with two different ideas of telling stories about the past, because in a lot of ways, films reflect concerns, they reflect values, they reflect morals, they reflect ideas about where we want to go as a society. And that's also what we're doing with history, right? Is understanding the past, hopefully to create the better present and an even better future. So those are things. But yeah, early on, Star Wars and Raiders, the Indiana Jones stuff, absolutely. That was, but I don't think I'm pretty part and parcel with a lot of people who grew up during that time period.
Is there a movie that made history, or movies that you either have shown as part of historians at the movie, or that you just enjoy personally? The movie that popped into my mind as I was asking this question is Birth of a Nation, the D.W. Griffith Klan movie. But is there, which I think Woodrow Wilson had screened at the White House.
He did, yeah.
Are there movies that in your mind have made history, changed behavior?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's a very conscious kind of thing I'm thinking. Ultimately, what we're trying to do on Sunday nights is have fun. And I'm not showing Birth of a Nation because piss on D.W. Griffith, pardon my French. I have no interest in doing that. People can look through it. I've seen Birth of a Nation. I've taught it like in a classroom before. I don't need folks to have to go back and relive that moment in time. But to answer your question, a great thing would be to talk about Jaws. Jaws comes out in 1975 and changes the way the world goes to the beach. I was just talking to a phenomenal scholar earlier today on the pod that we were recording, Elsa Vian. She wrote this tremendous brand new book that's coming out from Oxford University Press about the beach in Los Angeles in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. And I said, Elsa, were people talking about sharks? Absolutely not. You can't find sharks in the archive.
And it created the summer blockbuster.
Sure, it did. It changed the way, when you look at Jaws in 75 and Star Wars in 77, it changed the way Americans and the rest of the world go to the movies, right? Those things are not only a part of history, they not only telling histories, but they're also a part of history that get into these larger things about the way that we recreate and the way that we relate to one another. Now we're all going, it becomes the big tentpole blockbuster thing, becomes a thing in the summertime that we all get our buddies together. We all go watch Rambo or whatever. Yeah,
what about
those things change.
When you mentioned Jaws, the first thing I thought of is the Robert Shaw soliloquy about the USS Indianapolis, and how that one scene, the authorship of which is really disputed. I find it fascinating that there are multiple people who say that they wrote that Shaw's soliloquy as Captain Quint and the introduction of the USS Indianapolis into cultural history is one of the greatest things that's ever been done for a group of people who had otherwise been forgotten, partially because they didn't want to remember.
Yeah, it was a powerful moment. And it's amazing what Jaws does with that, because it's a blockbuster film and you're really dealing in a lot of ways with hype and hysteria in the ways that which power is communicated with that really hapless mayor and the sheriff and things like that. And then you get these quiet moments on board on the boat where Shaw is doing his thing. And, that's one of the best 4 minutes in film history when he's talking about the Indianapolis, right? And I'd wager to bet that most people had never heard of the Indianapolis or what had happened there before 1975. And now you've got this awakening of that story, which is very easy to find now in 2024.
Lynn Vincent and Sarah Vladeck, who wrote the definitive book, were on my podcast a 3 years ago talking about it. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to them is because the greatest East Side of Indianapolis legend of all time, Mr. James O'Donnell, was on the USS Indianapolis. And our families grew up together. We were all scared to death of him. Matter of fact, my brother Michael was his paper boy and was too scared to collect. We just put in the money himself. And Mr. O'Donnell was this phenomenal hero. And when you watch the documentary about Jaws, I don't know if you've seen it, it's superb. Spielberg and Dreyfuss and everyone. There's a section of the documentary, it's on YouTube, that has survivors of the USS Indianapolis talking about being in the theater, and then all of a sudden they start telling their story and how powerful it was. And I don't think there'd be a USS Indianapolis monument here, right here on the canal in downtown Indianapolis, if it wasn't for that movie. I'll mention another movie to you. I wrote something in the Indianapolis Star when I write for them occasionally and said that 2 movies ought to be required viewing for high school seniors. And you tell me which movies you think should be required viewing. But the 2 I wrote about are Saving Private Ryan and Mississippi Burning.
Oh, really good choices there. You were just talking about Shaw and the Indianapolis survivors who were going to see that film. And that immediately made me think about Saving Private Ryan, about how people, veterans of the war, said how difficult it was in a lot of ways for them to watch that film, because it really got to the heart of that experience on screen, right? And at their best, that's what films can do, right? They can really transport you to another place in time and illustrate for you in a way that is that frankly, the book simply can't, or as dynamic as my lecture style is, I still can't quite recreate. Same with Mississippi Burning, right? To drop you into an era, to let you see the attitudes, to give you a feeling for that. And those are excellent choices, by the way. For me, if you're doing an American history course, the first thing that comes to mind would be Glory. I think it is a phenomenal film. We actually just talked about it on the pod recently. It is outstanding.
And isn't that an example, just very quickly, sir, how a movie can take something, someone, some event that was forgotten and all of a sudden inject it into the public consciousness in a way that really no other medium can?
Yeah, I don't know that many people had heard about the 54th Massachusetts before Edward Zwick's Glory comes out in, I think, 89. And that film was really handled so well. I think I'm not a Civil War scholar myself. I have to do the historian thing where I go, this isn't my specialty. But I talked to a lot of Civil War scholars, and they just love the film. And I talked to descendants of folks who were enslaved in South Carolina during this time period, and they still talk about what this film means to them. Not this whole rivet counting kind of thing, but the idea of seeing Black soldiers fighting for their own freedom in a way in the United States where we grew up with films like Birth of a Nation, like you said earlier, Gone with the Wind, which is an equally devastatingly awful film for American history.
Except for Clark Gable lecturing everyone in the study as they have their brandy and cigars, where he says, get the living hell kicked out of you. I don't know what to tell you. You're all going to die.
I wish I could look like that guy. Oh my gosh. You can study the style. That guy had the charisma.
What do cannons mean, sir, to gentlemen? Sorry.
Another film I would talk about would actually be Amistad, which is set a bit earlier. Again, also dealing with the subject of slavery. When I was teaching, I taught 8th grade and also high school juniors as I was writing my dissertation in Florida. And I would show them, like, I can only talk about the transatlantic slave trade so much. It just, you can't convey what that is like to be stolen from your home, the families being ripped apart, the torture, all of these things. And these things are,
the light-skinned children.
Yeah, it's
William Henry Harrison had 6 kids who looked like you and me. But oops, guess how that happened.
Yeah, it's another one. And there are other films that you could use. The thing I always talk about with movies is this. So I'm 46. And when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, I'd see the substitute teacher roll the television that was strapped down to the cart, right? And you're like, I get the day off, right? I don't have to think today. And really, and I'll tell you, even as I was teaching high school and as a graduate teaching assistant at Minnesota, these were things I wrestled with because I'm like, I strongly believe that films have a real capacity to teach history if they're curated well. And even then I was like, I'm not taking the day off if I bring films in. But no, absolutely. I really think that movies can be a really terrific thing. Another one I really like is actually Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Which I've never seen, but I hear is very good.
Yeah, if you want to talk about the Great Depression in the South, absolutely. Or you can use it to talk about the Odyssey. You can talk about Odysseus and so forth. It's another great. And a lot of times you'll use clips from these kinds of films and stuff like that. But that's another film that I really, really enjoyed. And the students don't discount things like music and what music has to tell us and things like that. Now,
you've anticipated my next question. But okay, you go ahead, please. No.
I was going to say one of the most powerful nights we ever had on HATM when we did the watch thing on Sunday night was What's Love Got to Do with It, the Tina Turner biopic. Right. Now, I never showed that film in class because it has a sexual assault scene in there, and that's not a thing I felt comfortable exposing my students to that age. But I did play for them Tina Turner music in class when I was teaching 20th century United States. And I've got all these kids who were born in 2000 and whatever, they don't know Tina. Well, we're going to fix that today. Tina Turner, Chuck Berry blow their minds as well. What is this? And then the first time they saw Elvis on stage, when I would show clips of Elvis Presley, it had the same effect as it did back in the 50s. Who is this guy? So it was fun.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today is Dr. Jason Herbert. He has this incredible Twitter feed. Dr. Herbert, what's your Twitter handle again?
It's Herbert History, at Herbert History. It was the best thing I could think of at the time.
In his own time, he's the creator of Historians at the Movies, the longest running watch party on the internet, and Historians at the Movies podcast. And that's what we're talking about, his love of movies, how movies teach history, how it glorifies it and gets it wrong, perhaps. Now, we've mentioned that Jason is a Kentucky colonel. He is a proud Kentuckian. And if you look up on X, you will see him in his Kentucky gear. But I ask everyone, sorry, Dr. Herbert, I ask everyone who's not from Indiana this question.
Okay.
Is there a particular Hoosier leader and or legend you particularly admire?
Oh, man, I'm going to cop out and say my dad. This is where I actually say, wait a second, this Kentuckian is actually of Hoosier blood. My father was from Indiana, from Evansville. Another one I would actually say is Tecumseh. That Tecumseh was. We don't know exactly where Tecumseh was born. We know that there were Shawnee communities throughout Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky. We think he was actually probably born in Kentucky, and of course, Tecumseh himself would not say he was a Hoosier, right? He wouldn't say he's from. He wouldn't say he's aligned with the federal government. At the same time, this is a man who I think, like a lot of your listeners in Indiana, really loved that landscape there. And as a kid growing up in Western Kentucky, my dad in Evansville, spent a lot of time in the Hoosier State. It's a beautiful space.
Did you read Peter Cozzens' book?
No, I haven't.
Which I think
I read that one.
I don't know what it's called. I can look it up here in a second. Peter Cozzens is a terrific American historian. Anyway, he came on the podcast and discussed it. And I don't know if it was Tecumseh and the Prophet or something like that, but I'm going to get it. Okay.
His brother, Tezcuatahua.
Yeah. Let me make you angry and ask you why, when I asked you who your favorite Hoosier leader and or legend is, you didn't answer Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, that's easy because he's from Kentucky. The state of Illinois has been trying to take that man from us for years. I know that Lincoln.
He was there for a week. What the hell are you talking about? He couldn't get out of Kentucky fast enough.
He's our boy. He's our boy. You can't have him. I will come over the Ohio and listen. There are a lot of great people. I don't want to fight all y'all. Y'all do outnumber me, and that in Colorado would be difficult. So listen, Lincoln, we're all going to fight about him, which is exactly what we shouldn't be doing. Could you guys not fight? Could you not have civil war?
There's a friend of mine who came from the podcast named Joshua Claiborne. Joshua, if you're listening to this one, who he spends a lot of his time helping people, but one of his great interests in his scholarship is just convincing people Lincoln is a Hoosier. So Joshua, if you're listening, I'm on your side. Let me ask you a question, because you did mention Tecumseh, and it led into something that I had written down. Is there a movie that gets, or movies that get, the Native American experience right?
Boy, is that ever a tough one to get into? I don't know. And here's why. I'm hesitant to refer to anything as the Native American experience. One of the things I try to teach about when I'm teaching Native history or working as a travel liaison for the Forest Service, or just talking in general, people ask me what my interests or things like that. I formerly got to work for a couple tribes, which really informed a lot of my thinking on this, is that Native America, whether North, South, Central America, anyway, is just as diverse as any other space that you could ever ask for in the past and in the present today. So it's difficult to say Native America or anything like that, to say, oh, the Native experience or anything like that. Just like it would be difficult to say, hey, what's the Hoosier experience, or what's the Black experience, or what's the anything else like that. I would tell you, though, I don't want to cop out on that. So let me at least say there's some films that I really do. There are parts of films that I really do like a lot. The first thing that comes to mind, and again, these are not perfect films.
Sure.
But Last of the Mohicans really comes to mind in some ways when you talk about rivalries over showing the ways that colonialism really ripped through a lot of indigenous communities forcing people to decide, hey, I want to align myself with these colonists or these colonists, or we want to stay as far away as we possibly can. That's one that I think does that pretty well. I'm trying to think right now as far as things out west, because there are we're starting to see this resurgence of films right now moving west. A film actually I really was Hell or High Water, and that takes place in the modern era, written I believe and directed by Taylor Sheridan. And you see a character by the name of Gil Birmingham talking about, and this film is really about generational poverty, but talking a lot about how settlers took indigenous lands, and now those lands are being taken from the descendants of settlers by wealthy people and things like that. And like this is continually happening over and over again. So I think that was a really interesting film.
May I ask you about another one?
About that, sure.
Forgive me. May I ask you about another one? Steven Spielberg famously, and you probably know this, watches I think the same 3 or 4 movies before he starts a movie. And he single-handedly, I believe, has brought this movie into prominence in the modern mind and culture. Mm-hmm. The Searchers.
Oh, sure.
Last I looked on the greatest films of all time, it was in the top 10. It's unbelievable how Steven Spielberg has elevated the knowledge and the reverence for that movie. How would you describe it?
It's been a while since I've seen The Searchers, right? But Searchers is really a product of its time. Of course, we're talking about the John Wayne film, and I want to say Ford directed it, if I'm correct. Did he not? So you get these amazing vistas. If there are 2 things John Ford is well known for. One is these amazing views. You can't really think about the West in film without thinking about John Ford's just panoramic scenery. He's also one of the only guys to really tell John Wayne what he thought of, could really tell John Wayne what to do.
Because Wayne didn't serve in World War II, and John Ford never let him forget it.
Yeah, Searchers is really a product of its time, where they're out there and trying to search, I think, for Wayne's nieces, if I recall correctly. It's been a while.
That's all right.
And once they find her, now Wayne wants to go off and kill, I think it's Comanches. It's been so long since I've seen this film.
But the sense of the movie with following the pattern of the white hero, sure, white male hero, encountering this simple yet sadistic tribe that is roaming around the desert. Has there been a turn away from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of ways, the way we think about the West was, in a lot of ways, I used to sit on the couch with my grandfather, watch Turner Classic Movies and the Western Channel and stuff like that. And we see these John Wayne films, we see the Clint Eastwood movies where Native folks were often not portrayed by Native actors, right? And then also portrayed in ways that were simply untrue. Savage is the word. It's a word I don't like to use, so I'm going to put savage in quotation marks, because that word has been used to dehumanize Native folks for a very long time, and showing them to be just bloodthirsty, all of these kinds of thundering over the horizon to take from whites and things like that. When the reality is, people who were invading anyone's lands were actually white people, right? They were all on Native lands. And I think that film has really started to show that. There's a tremendous movement right now in indigenous filmmaking that addresses these kinds of things. In a lot of ways, I think in a lot of ways you have to talk about Dances with Wolves. And Dances is not by any means a perfect film. There are a lot of critics of this film, including a lot of friends of mine who are Native, who do not like the film at all. And I totally appreciate thinking it's yet another white savior film, right? I think that's really the big critique there. At the same time, that film comes out, I believe, in 1990, and really puts indigenous people on screen in ways that you hear Native languages, Native people speaking there and speaking Native languages, acting in ways that are not the ways that we saw on The Searchers. Now, again, Dances is not a perfect film, but really you start to see that shift post Dances with Wolves, where now you see a lot more films coming out that are trying to tell these stories that are sympathetic to indigenous voices, starring indigenous actors and telling indigenous storytellers, and many of them being told by indigenous filmmakers themselves, which I think is really exciting. We
were talking earlier about movies that changed the game, if That's the way we want to put it.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to mention another movie that when I read about it or listen to a documentary, the way people talked about it was different than how they had talked about kind of other movies of the same genre. And that is The Exorcist.
I hate scary movies so much. And we showed that. I
You
do
hate
not
scary
like,
movies?
oh my goodness, yes. Especially things dealing with faith, right? So I grew up in a very religious household, things like that growing up. And naturally things that talked about the afterlife or things like that really terrified me. And The Exorcist, oh my gosh, the idea of we've got your mother. Oh no. Yeah, it really does.
The
You've got a lot of films
lines,
that
the phenomenon. It became a
oh my
cultural phenomenon in 73. Godfather did as well, completely different in 72, completely different movie, but people fainting, people running out of the
yeah.
theater. That's not made up. You talk to people who are like, I watched the first half hour and I just couldn't take it and I left.
No, and I think that's for me. I think that there's two reasons for that. I think one, filmmaking techniques continue to evolve over time, where you can have the jump scares and different kind of stuff and different kind of things that you actually visually see on screen combined with the music and so forth. And I think a larger thing is like, why do say films that deal with the afterlife or the supernatural? Yeah, absolutely. Continue to frighten people in ways that like a axe murderer movie might not, right? It hits you on a different level. And I think that speaks to something inside the film going audience that relates to the things in ways that like sometimes you're watching Jason, you're like, all right, go get those teenagers. Whereas I'm watching X, boy.
When my son watched The Exorcist after his birthday when he was in 8th grade, I looked at him and smiled. I'm like, Andrew, you're finally Catholic. What's the worst movie that you would acknowledge is absolutely horrible, terrible, that you really enjoy?
Worst movie? Oh my gosh, that is such a great question. I haven't but the worst film. Now I'm doing the search that I enjoy. As a historian, this is really that question you get back to earlier. Was like, can you watch a movie and not just tear it apart the whole time? My answer is probably going to be The Patriot, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier, just because it's a really fun movie to watch. And now Mel Gibson movies have this whole other thing where I'm watching Mel Gibson. I'm like, Mel, why do you have to be Mel? Why do you have to be this way? But aside from that, there are things as a scholar where I watch this going, okay, this is complete nonsense. Going back to the idea, like I said earlier, of the free blacks living on a plantation in South Carolina, folks, that just did not happen. These folks would have absolutely been enslaved by our protagonist, right? The English did not burn down churches full of people during the American Revolution, right?
Minister Tarleton was a bit of a dick, but yes, I agree.
Absolutely, he was. Banniston, listen,
which is why I love
Isaacs is so great.
Cowpens is my favorite American.
It is. Okay, so again, it's a fun movie to watch. And there are things to watch about that. There's illusions. Dad, what did you do during the 7 Years' War? That's awesome stuff. It's super, man, that movie is super raw. And I go, oh, man, this war is complicated. So off the top of my head, if I had more time to think, I would probably say something else because I know that I like other terrible films. Hot Tub Time Machine is not a great movie, but oh my gosh, that also deals with the past. And I love it. But we'll go with The Patriot now because this is a history-themed conversation we're having right now. Does not mean that Jason Herbert does not love America. Folks, I absolutely devoted myself to learning American history. I love it. Oh, my gosh.
We don't judge on the Leaders.
Oh, absolutely judge. Just not on that.
Our guest is Dr. Jason Herbert. He's a storyteller. He has a terrific X account, which I highly recommend that you follow. He is also the creator of Historians at the Movies, the longest running watch party on the internet, and Historians at the Movie podcast. I'm going to ask you a question that I've asked governors, senators, other people of importance. What is the funniest movie ever made?
It's a history movie. It's Monty Python and the Holy Grail. There's no doubt.
Have you watched that? Have you watched that on your streaming?
We've watched it twice. And I can remember, and I can tell you, this is, again, remember talking about how we remember. I remember the very first time I watched this film. We were at my friend Mike's house, his grandparents' house, like 1996, VHS. on like the 19-inch cruddy TV, right? Watching the credits, a moose bit my sister. And I'm like, what is this nonsense? And I had no understanding what I was watching. And of course, you have to go back and watch it again and again. And then I've seen that movie so many times. For me, Monty Python and the Holy Grail has got to be the greatest, probably the best movie, probably the best piece of art ever made. Beyond Mona Lisa, beyond Michelangelo. Yeah, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Final answer on that one.
Who fires first, Greedo or Han Solo?
That's a trick question, my friend, because only Han fires. Greedo does not get a chance to fire. When you have Greedo firing in the Mos Eisley Cantina, you change everything we need to know about Han Solo, which is this guy is a rogue. He's shady. He will listen. Greedo had a gun pointed at him, so it's not shooting him in cold blood. He's absolutely entitled to shoot Greedo, right? But the whole idea is, yeah, I bet you have. And then he shoots him. Oh, please. No, Greedo doesn't even fire. It is nobody fires first. Only Han fires.
Have you watched the movie Hoosiers?
No. It is the only film that is banned from HATM. This will not get me over with your audience.
Now we are judging. Now we are judging.
I am a Kentucky basketball fan before I'm anything else in life. I grew up hating Bobby Knight. Boy, you guys are throwing stuff at me right now. I think we just lost the listeners here. So I have a rule that says we shall not give honor to anything about Indiana basketball ever. However, I do have my favorite Indiana film. I will go that far. I just won't say it's
Breaking Away.
Absolutely, it's Breaking Away. How did you know?
It's a brilliant movie.
Breaking Away is magnificent. That is a beautiful film. We haven't had the opportunity to show it on HATM yet because it hasn't been on one of the streaming providers. And it's a film that I'm very much wanting to do because I watched it as a kid. I've watched it probably the last 3 years or so. I think Breaking Away is an amazing film. Just absolutely love it.
Is there a history movie that, we talk a lot about, for example, Braveheart, Oscar winner, incredibly entertaining. The history is, it's almost made up. Matter of fact, it is made up in certain aspects of it. But the entertainment value is amazing. And we like to be critical of those sorts of things. But is there a movie that just gets the history right? This is what happened. And they did a damn good job of telling you, no matter what else they did in the movie, they got the history.
A really interesting film that I really like is actually Free State of Jones. That's actually based upon the book of the same name, and the woman who wrote the book actually got to have input on that film. And if you've seen Free State of Jones, you know that they're making some very real ties between, say, the Civil War, the Civil Rights era, and I think they really do well with Free State of Jones. And it's really difficult to watch, showing the Reconstruction era in the South and how dangerous that was under sharecropping, about how terrorism onto now free blacks in the South did not end just because the war was over.
It's a whole level of tragedy beyond.
Yeah.
To me, and this is a strained comparison that I'm not trying to make literally, but when you think of World War II and the Holocaust together, you get Civil War and Jim Crow, Reconstruction, all of that together. To me, how something that should never have happened or should have ended. And you read about the Jewish folks who were liberated from the camps, and 2 years later, they're still living behind barbed wire. It's just not German concentration camp barbed wire. It's that no one will take them, so they have no place to go. Did you watch Schindler's List? What did you think of that?
I haven't been able to watch Schindler's List. And I have trouble watching stuff like that because I'm not Jewish. I don't have direct ties to the Holocaust or anything like that. But that film, I've seen bits and pieces of it throughout the years, hits me so hard that where even me as a historian who should be able to sit and analyze it and critique it, it's a hard watch for me. There are certain films like that where I just really struggle with what I've seen on screen. And I can't explain that in ways where I can say, hey, I can't watch Schindler's List, but I can watch 12 Years a Slave, right? Or I can these films. Schindler's List for me is a tough hang. And
I've only watched it once. I need to watch it again, but I only watched it once when it first came out. Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan, which obviously has the epic opening scene, are the only two movies I've ever been to in the theater when the movie ended, nobody left.
Yeah. Yeah, they're powerful films.
We mentioned Mel Gibson a few minutes ago, and we have a few minutes left with Jason Herbert. What did you think, and have you watched? And I confess I've not seen it. Passion of the Christ.
Boy, so
I know people who walked out of it crying. People
sure.
I know who went to go see it, and I know people who went there, and while he was being scourged, you had the audience screaming, "Stop it!" Powerful.
Mhm. Yeah. So I've seen it exactly one time. And this is another film that, like, it's for me, it's a tough hang. I remember I saw it in the theater when it first came out. I can't remember the year when the film comes out. I want to say it was 2001, 2002, somewhere in that range.
It's 3 or 4, 2003 or 4, yeah.
Yeah, I was living in West Palm Beach, Florida. I went and saw it with a friend of mine. And I remember Gibson is such a powerful filmmaker that he's got a real gift for demonstrating for telling a story on screen. I remember just being like overwhelmed by what I was seeing as far as the graphic detail of that. And again, it speaks, like I said, I'm not really a guy of faith anymore. Growing up, you read these things. Oh, okay, Jesus nailed to the Christ. Okay, they whipped him, blah, blah, blah. And then you see it on screen. And again, it speaks to the power that the medium has to demonstrate to you historical events, things like that. It's a film that I should probably go back and watch at some point in time, now more as a historian than anything else. And I know a lot of people really relate to it, especially folks who of that belief, but it's been a while. I just remember the emotions of that film, and that's certainly a tough one.
About 12 years ago, what was it, 2000, maybe 12? There were 2 history movies that up against each other and for the best picture Oscar, and Argo won out over Lincoln.
Yeah.
It seems crazy, but as beautiful and wonderful and compelling as Lincoln is, I do think Argo is a better movie. Am I wrong?
I think that a lot of people, if you remember back in that time period, there were a lot of people trying to associate Lincoln with Indiana, and I think that really hurt its Oscar chances. So,
yeah, it does. If they had movie theaters in Kentucky, then they could have watched it.
Oh, snap, man! They're both really good films. I think that Ben Affleck is a superb director. He's really talking about a really crafty filmmaker who can take a story and move you along. Argo moves quickly. You feel Lincoln when you're watching. That movie feels every bit of 3 hours. Argo moves along pretty well. But here's the cool thing. You had 2 really well-made historical dramas that were nominated for the Academy Award that year. And I recall both of them doing well in the box office, which speaks to the idea that I think that there is a general desire for the past to be told on film and told. Again, both of those films take some liberties. You have to, right? But there are so many other stories waiting to be told that I would love to see on screen, either on a big screen or you can see on Netflix or some of the other shows. Stars a few years ago had a terrific show called Black Sails, if you're familiar with this, about the golden age of piracy and set in 1715 in the Bahamas and so forth. It said it's a precursor to Treasure Island. And again, it's a fictional history, but you can take so much out of that and learn so much about the period that, I think there's a real desire for it.
Is that, and this is the last question before we get to the final 5 questions we ask all of our podcast guests, Dr. Herbert, is Oppenheimer an example of that there is a huge market for a smart, great adult history film? It made, I think, hundreds, and if not over $1 billion at this point. It's a superb movie. I was stationed at White Sands Missile Range when I was in the Army.
No kidding. Wow.
And where they detonated the bomb. And I thought it was superb, but a lot of the articles that I read about it weren't necessarily about the movie. It was about the reaction to the movie.
Sure. I think Oppenheimer is the second best film I've seen in the 21st century. The Social Network being the exception to, and again, Social Network also being a history film, right? I think Oppenheimer is terrific, and it did so well. I think absolutely, right? And if I may, there's another film that I think did that really well as well. It's called Godzilla minus one. And that is a Godzilla film that came out of Toho Studios, came out of Japan this year. It was in release here in the United States for a short time, Japanese only. But what it's doing, it's a Godzilla movie that is not about Godzilla. It is about Japanese people dealing with what it means to lose in World War II, much in the way that many of our films in the late 70s throughout the 80s were dealing with American feelings towards Vietnam. So in a lot of ways, Oppenheimer and Godzilla minus one are really two sides of the same coin, both very much dealing with history, showing that you can come across it from a couple different angles.
I should note for the record, the two movies he says are the best of the 21st century. He obviously, Professor Herbert, and I don't blame you. You can't remember everything. You've obviously forgotten that Step Brothers came out in 2008. We have reached the point.
We've shown that on HATM.
I
love that movie.
Absolutely. It should be in the Smithsonian. Anyway, we've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests.
Okay.
Professor Herbert, are you ready?
No idea, but we're going to find out.
What was your first job?
My first job was working at a Wendy's in Murray, Kentucky. So for those of you who know where Murray, Kentucky is, Western Kentucky, I worked the fries and I worked my way up to the grill, but I was really good at the cash register and the checkout line or in the drive-through line. So
I had a beautiful young lady who worked for me a couple of times. Jessica, if you're out there, this is for you. She was from Fancy Farm, Kentucky.
Oh, yeah.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
Ricky Skaggs. That's the Kentucky in me.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Oh my God. Now we're talking here. Okay. I need to give you a history book, right? I would say, okay, my favorite book I've ever read, I actually just came out last year. It's called Wild New World. It's by Dan Flores. And if and when I ever grow up, I want to be Dan Flores. Dan Flores took about 25,000 years of environmental history in North America and condensed them into about 400 pages, talking about a beautifully written book that encapsulates environmental history, talks about American policy, talks about national parks, talks about hunting, talks about all of these things, the ways in which the environment has shaped American history and vice versa. It is everything I wish I could write. It is spellbinding. It's arguably the most beautifully written book I've ever read. And it is just fascinating. So
the name of it again?
Wild New World. Wild New World by Dan Flores.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Any event in history, be there as it happened. I'd probably stop Lincoln's family from leaving Kentucky. But let me think. On a serious note here, any event in history that I could see. Boy, that is a really tough one because I want to go over. I'm going to go back. The first thing pops in my mind is actually I would love to see old Greece. The historian in me, as I grew up, to think about the mythology and all these things and Alexander and things like that.
Like a meeting of the democracy sort of thing, or?
Yeah. The other part of me just says this is the environmental historian in me, which says I would really like to see what it was like to fish off the Keys before all the Europeans. I would love to see the old fishing ground. So for anybody who's listening here likes to hunt and fish, the environmental historian in me says I want to know just how good the fishing was back in the day.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat about anything, whom would you choose?
Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter all day long. Seems to be, obviously he's lived this amazing life, served his country, Navy officer, certainly he was president at the time.
He went to Annapolis Naval Academy.
Yes, yeah. And then after his presidency, spent all of this time as a diplomat, serving communities in various different means and things like that. When I think about anybody who I could live, and of course, President Carter he's in hospice now, right. But a conversation with the man, he just seems like a good human. And I would really like to know what it's like to be a good human like him. So I would say President Carter.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NF P, a national insurance broker with strong local content. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been our new favorite Hoosier, Dr. Jason Herbert. He is a storyteller. He is an entrepreneur for sure, because what you do with your podcast is amazing. He is the creator of Historians at the Movies, the longest running watch party on the internet, and Historians at the Movies podcast, which talks about history through film and everything else in between. Dr. Herbert, please again tell people how to follow you on X and become a participant in what you're trying to do. Not what you're trying to do, what you've been doing, because it seems so fun, and anything that can make history fun needs to happen.
Yeah, certainly. So the best way to find me is on X, Twitter, at Herbert History. You can also find Historians of the Movies has an Instagram page if you want to find that, or you can even find me at Herbert History on Instagram. It's mostly pictures of my cat and dog and whatever weights I'm lifting that day. You can find me there. Also on Blue Sky, again, at Herbert History. Those are the easiest way to find. And again, we watch films every single Sunday night. You can also find the podcast. It's Historians at the Movies podcast. You can find that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere that you listen to your stuff. So that's where you can find me.
You've been a wonderful guest. I've enjoyed the conversation immensely. Thank you so much. I'm going to give you one last shot at the Hoosier State. You want to take it?
Yeah, I love you guys. Please. No, I'll tell you what, here's the great thing. Here's my first memories of Indiana. It was Bobby Knight basketball, right? And these great rivalries between Kentucky and Indiana. So I always talk about the Hoosiers thing and so forth. But as we grew up, I would go into Evansville where my dad lived, and just always had I've got the best memories of Indiana. So of course, like any good Kentuckian, I'm going to razz the Hoosier State, but man, I do just love it up that way. Really gorgeous land, great people up that way.
37 years ago, I was in basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Oh, yes, sir.
So that's still my favorite place. Thank you so much, Dr. Herbert, for coming on the podcast.
Man, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.